You don't belong in this hotel. The sentence landed in the marble lobby like a dropped glass, sharp enough to turn heads from the check-in desk to the far wall of elevators. And for a brief moment, the quiet luxury of the Sterling Grand Hotel in downtown Chicago seemed to freeze in place. Guests paused mid-conversation, a bell cart stopped rolling, and even the soft piano music drifting from the lounge bar felt like it had missed a note. Standing in the center of the lobby was a woman in dark jeans and a simple black jacket, calm, composed, and completely still. Her name was Jada Sterling. To the people staring at her now, she looked like someone who had wandered into a space meant for someone else. But what no one in that room realized, at least not yet, was that the building they were standing in existed because of her. The man confronting her, hotel manager Ethan Cole, stood behind the polished front desk with the stiff posture of someone certain he was in control. He had been watching her for nearly 2 minutes, studying the way she walked in alone, the way she carried no luggage, the way she didn't rush like most guests who just stepped out of a cab on a humid July afternoon. And in his mind, he had already made a decision. "Ma'am," he said again, louder this time so the people nearby could hear. "This lobby is for registered guests only." Jada didn't raise her voice. She didn't roll her eyes. She simply looked around the room once, slowly, as if taking inventory of the place. The chandeliers above reflected softly off the marble floor. The concierge desk stood to the right beside a tall arrangement of white lilies. 2 businessmen in suits had stopped whispering to watch. A family near the elevators had turned fully toward the scene. Phones were beginning to rise subtly, not quite recording yet, but close. Jada's expression didn't change. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she said evenly. Ethan let out a short laugh, the kind people use when they believe they're exposing a lie. "Look," he replied, lowering his voice just enough to sound patient, but not kind. "I manage this hotel. I know every VIP that walks through those doors. And you're not one of them." The air shifted slightly, tension moving through the room. Like static before a storm. Jada tilted her head just a little, almost curious. She had heard versions of that sentence before, in restaurants, in boardrooms, in places where people believed power always wore a suit and arrived in a black car with tinted windows. But today she had walked in alone. No assistant, no security, no announcement. Just a quiet visit to a property she hadn't personally seen in months. "Are you sure about that?" she asked. Ethan folded his arms, confident now that the crowd had begun to watch. "Positive." A young concierge a few feet away glanced nervously between them. Somewhere behind the desk a printer started humming, then stopped again. Outside, a taxi honked faintly on Michigan Avenue. Jada slipped one hand into the pocket of her jacket and looked calmly at the manager standing across from her. "That's interesting," she said. "Because if you manage this hotel, you should probably know who owns it." And just like that, the room grew even quieter, though Ethan Cole had no idea that the next 9 minutes were about to change every job in that lobby. For a moment, Ethan Cole just stared at her as if he had misheard the sentence completely. Around them, the Sterling Grand lobby remained frozen in that fragile silence that appears when a room senses something important has just been said, but no one is sure what it means yet. Ethan blinked once and let out a short breath through his nose. "That is funny," he said, shaking his head slowly. "Very funny." A few guests shifted their weight nearby. Someone whispered to a companion near the elevators. The concierge at the side desk looked down at the reservation monitor and then quickly back up again. Jada Sterling did not move. She simply stood there with the relaxed posture of someone who had nowhere else to be and nothing to prove. Outside the tall glass doors, a summer wind pushed lightly against the city traffic of downtown Chicago, but inside the hotel the tension hung thick like humidity before a storm. Ethan straightened the lapels of his charcoal suit jacket and leaned one hand on the polished front desk. "Listen carefully," he said, lowering his voice, but making sure the people nearby could still hear. "This hotel belongs to Sterling Hospitality Group. It is a billion-dollar company with properties in 8 states. The owner of this hotel does not walk in wearing jeans and a travel jacket with no luggage." Jada tilted her head slightly, studying him the way someone studies an interesting puzzle. "Is that so?" she asked calmly. Ethan gestured toward the entrance. "What is so is that this lobby is for paying guests and scheduled visitors. If you are here for a meeting, you need to check in with the front desk. If you are not, then you need to leave." One of the bellhops, standing beside a luggage cart, glanced nervously between them. The young concierge named Daniel Ortiz felt his stomach tighten as he watched the exchange. Something about the woman felt familiar, but he could not place it yet. Jada slowly removed her hand from the pocket of her jacket and rested it gently on the edge of the marble desk. "I do have a reservation," she said. Ethan raised his eyebrows with exaggerated patience. "Do you?" "Penthouse suite," she continued. "Under the name Sterling." The words landed quietly, but they rippled through the small crowd forming behind her. Daniel Ortiz turned immediately toward his screen and began typing. Ethan noticed and shot him a quick look that made the young concierge freeze. "There is no reservation under that name," Ethan said quickly before Daniel could speak. "And even if there were, guests do not arrive like this." Jada glanced around the lobby again. The Sterling Grand was exactly how she remembered it from the architectural plans and investor presentations 3 years earlier. 12 floors, 210 rooms. Italian marble shipped from Verona. A grand staircase designed to photograph beautifully for wedding receptions. She had approved every detail from a conference room in Los Angeles during the final year of construction. Now she was standing inside the finished building, and the man managing it believed she did not belong. "You are very confident," she said quietly. Ethan gave a small shrug. "Confidence comes from experience." A woman near the seating area lifted her phone slightly higher, clearly recording now. Ethan noticed, but did not seem concerned. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "I am asking you one last time to leave the property before security escorts you out." The word security traveled through the room like a spark. Daniel Ortiz felt his heart beat faster as he looked back down at the reservation screen. Because now, the system had finished loading, and right there on the monitor was a reservation that made his eyes widen slightly. Penthouse suite. Guest name, Sterling Jada. Owner priority access. Daniel looked up slowly toward the woman standing at the desk, then toward Ethan Cole, whose expression still carried absolute certainty. And in that moment, the young concierge realized something that the hotel manager had not yet understood at all. Daniel Ortiz felt the air leave his lungs as the reservation screen finished loading in front of him. The letters were clear. Too clear to misunderstand. Penthouse suite. Guest name, Jada Sterling. Owner priority access. For a second, he thought maybe the system had glitched. Maybe someone had typed the name as a joke or a test entry. But the reservation carried a level tag he had only seen once before during training. Executive clearance. Owner tier. Daniel slowly looked up from the monitor toward the woman standing calmly at the front desk. Jada Sterling had not moved. Her posture remained relaxed, her expression steady, almost thoughtful, as if she had already seen this moment play out before somewhere else in another building with another manager, just as certain he understood the world. Around them, the lobby continued to thicken with curiosity. A businessman near the lounge chairs whispered something to his colleague, while a couple visiting from out of town openly watched now, without pretending otherwise. 2 phones were clearly recording. The bellhop beside the luggage cart shifted his feet and glanced at Daniel, as if silently asking what was happening. Ethan Cole, however, still stood in complete confidence. He rested both hands on the marble counter and leaned forward slightly toward Jada. "Security will be here in about 30 seconds, he said in a measured voice that suggested he believed the situation was already finished. "I recommend you leave with your dignity before that becomes necessary." Jada studied him quietly for a moment. Her eyes moved briefly across the lobby, taking in the staircase, the lighting, the polished floors she had approved during construction. She remembered the blueprint presentations, the investor calls, the long nights building Sterling Hospitality Group into something powerful enough to buy buildings like this one in cities across the country. And now she was standing inside one of those buildings being told she did not belong. She did not look angry. If anything, she looked patient. "You seem very sure about this," she said calmly. Ethan nodded without hesitation. "Because I know how my hotel operates." Behind the desk, Daniel swallowed and cleared his throat quietly. His fingers hovered above the keyboard as he stared again at the reservation screen, hoping he had somehow misread it. But the name remained there exactly the same. Sterling Jada. Owner access. His pulse began to beat faster. Training manuals flashed through his memory, specifically the part that mentioned owner visits. Staff were told they might arrive unannounced. They might dress casually. They might observe operations quietly before introducing themselves. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He slowly looked from the screen back to the woman at the desk, then toward Ethan Cole. The manager had no idea. Not yet. Daniel shifted his weight and spoke carefully. "Sir," he said softly. Ethan did not even turn around. "Daniel, not now." The young concierge hesitated. Guests were definitely filming now. One of them even stepped a little closer. Jada noticed Daniel's expression and gave him the slightest nod, almost encouraging him to trust what he was seeing. Daniel took a breath. "Sir, there is actually a reservation in the system," he said carefully. Ethan exhaled sharply in annoyance and turned halfway toward him. "I already checked the system earlier." "Yes, sir," Daniel replied, his voice steady but cautious. "But this one just appeared when I refreshed the page." Ethan frowned and walked toward the monitor with slow irritation, clearly expecting to prove the concierge wrong in front of everyone watching. He leaned over Daniel's shoulder and scanned the screen quickly. At first his expression showed nothing. Then his eyebrows tightened slightly. Because the reservation was right there. Penthouse Suite. Sterling, Jada. Owner priority access. Ethan stared at the name for several seconds as the room behind him waited. Phones remained raised. Conversations had stopped completely. The silence returned, heavier than before. Ethan straightened slowly and looked back toward the woman standing across the desk. Jada Sterling met his eyes calmly. The faintest hint of a knowing smile touched the corner of her mouth, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. Ethan Cole remained still for a moment longer than anyone expected. The name on the reservation screen seemed to hold his attention like a small crack appearing in a wall he had believed was solid. Penthouse Suite. Sterling, Jada. Owner priority access. The words were not subtle. They were not ambiguous. And yet Ethan leaned closer to the monitor as if the letters might rearrange themselves if he stared long enough. Behind him the silence in the lobby thickened. The quiet piano music from the lounge had ended and no one had noticed. Guests stood still with their phones lifted just enough to capture everything without drawing attention to themselves. Daniel Ortiz felt the tension in his shoulders as he watched the manager read the screen again. He knew what the reservation meant. Training had explained it clearly. Owner-level access was not something the system displayed by accident. It required executive authorization from the central office in Los Angeles. Daniel slowly looked from the monitor to Jada Sterling standing across the desk. She had not changed her posture at all. Her expression remained composed, patient, almost curious. It was the expression of someone who had seen this exact moment unfold in different buildings many times before. Ethan finally straightened and turned halfway back toward her. For a brief second, uncertainty flickered across his face, but it vanished almost immediately. He folded his arms again, regaining the confident tone he had been using since the beginning. "That reservation must have been entered incorrectly," he said. His voice carried through the lobby clearly enough for the small crowd to hear. It happens sometimes when corporate systems synchronize. Daniel blinked slowly. Even the bellhop beside the luggage cart shifted uncomfortably at that explanation. Jada Sterling tilted her head slightly. "Entered incorrectly," she repeated. Ethan nodded once, now leaning his weight casually against the desk as if the situation had already been resolved. "Yes, the system occasionally displays test reservations from the corporate network. They are not real bookings." Jada glanced briefly toward Daniel. The young concierge could feel his pulse rising again. The reservation tag still glowed on the screen behind Ethan. Owner priority access. That label did not belong to test reservations. But Ethan had already turned back toward her with the polite firmness of a manager closing a conversation. "So as I was saying earlier," he continued, "this lobby is not available for people who are not registered guests." One of the guests near the staircase whispered something to a friend. The phones were definitely recording now. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from curiosity to anticipation. Everyone sensed the tension building, but no one wanted to interrupt it. Jada rested her fingertips lightly on the marble desk and studied Ethan with quiet attention. "Let me understand something," she said calmly. "You are certain the reservation system is wrong?" Ethan gave a short, confident smile. "Absolutely." Jada nodded slowly, as if considering that answer carefully. The soft afternoon light from the front windows reflected across the polished floor between them. "And you are certain that I do not belong here?" Ethan did not hesitate. "Completely certain." Daniel swallowed. The room seemed to hold its breath again. Jada looked around the lobby once more, taking in the tall columns, the chandelier above the staircase, the reception desk that had been built exactly to the measurements she had approved years earlier. For a brief moment, her eyes lingered on the hotel logo behind Ethan's shoulder. Sterling Grand, the brand she had built from a single property more than a decade earlier. When she looked back at Ethan, her voice remained calm. "That is interesting," she said quietly. "Because the corporate office you mentioned reports directly to me." The words landed softly, but they traveled through the lobby like a ripple across still water. Several guests exchanged looks. Daniel's eyes widened slightly as he turned back toward the monitor. Ethan stared at her again, this time with a hint of confusion returning to his expression. And for the first time since the confrontation began, the certainty in his posture began to weaken. The words settled into the room slowly, almost gently, but the effect they carried was immediate. "The corporate office you mentioned reports directly to me." For several seconds no one spoke. The quiet in the Sterling Grand lobby now felt heavier than before, like the air inside a courtroom just before a verdict. Ethan Cole stared at Jada Sterling with the strained expression of a man trying to decide whether he had just heard a joke or a threat. Behind him, the reservation screen still glowed softly on the concierge monitor. "Penthouse Suite. Sterling, Jada. Owner priority access." Daniel Ortiz stood frozen beside the keyboard, aware that every person in the lobby was now watching the manager's reaction. Ethan blinked once and let out a dry laugh that did not quite reach his eyes. "That is not possible," he said carefully, straightening his jacket again, as if resetting the situation through posture alone. Sterling Hospitality Group is run by a board of executives and a chief executive officer who lives in Los Angeles. Jada nodded slowly. "That is correct." Ethan tilted his head slightly, convinced he had found the flaw in her statement. "Then you understand why this claim does not make sense." A few guests exchanged curious looks. One man near the staircase whispered quietly, trying to remember where he had heard the name Sterling before. The phones recording the scene remained steady in several hands. Daniel glanced again at the screen and then at Jada, realizing the moment had moved far beyond a simple misunderstanding at the front desk. Jada rested both hands lightly against the marble counter and spoke in the same calm tone she had used from the beginning. "You are right about the company structure," she said. "Sterling Hospitality Group is headquartered in Los Angeles and operates properties across 8 states. Ethan nodded quickly, eager to confirm his position. "Exactly," Jada continued without raising her voice. "The company currently manages 114 hotels, including this one." The guests closest to the desk leaned slightly closer, listening. Ethan's expression shifted again, confusion pressing through his certainty. "Yes," he said cautiously. Jada held his gaze. "And the chief executive officer you mentioned is named Jada Sterling." The room did not react immediately. The words landed quietly, almost casually, but their meaning spread through the crowd a moment later like a slow wave of realization. Daniel felt his chest tighten. The bellhop beside the luggage cart blinked twice. Someone near the lounge chairs whispered, "Wait." Ethan Cole did not speak at first. He simply looked at her, as if he were searching her face for some sign that the statement was part of a joke he had not yet understood. Jada did not smile. She did not move. She simply waited. Ethan's eyes shifted briefly toward the hotel logo mounted behind the desk. Sterling Grand, the brand he had proudly introduced to countless guests since taking the manager position. Then his gaze drifted back to the reservation screen glowing on the monitor beside Daniel. The name had not changed. Sterling, Jada. Owner priority access. Daniel slowly stepped back from the keyboard, allowing the screen to remain visible. Several guests leaned their heads slightly to see it more clearly. Ethan inhaled slowly and straightened again, but the confidence that had filled his voice earlier had begun to crack. "That does not prove anything," he said, though the words sounded less certain than before. Jada tilted her head slightly, the calm patience still present in her expression. "You are right," she replied quietly. "It does not prove anything yet." The faint sound of a phone notification echoed somewhere in the lobby as another guest began recording. The quiet tension continued to build. Every eye focused on the manager who had been so certain only minutes earlier that the woman standing in front of him did not belong in his hotel. The silence that followed her last sentence stretched across the Sterling Grand lobby like a tightening wire. Ethan Cole stood very still behind the marble desk, his mind racing through every explanation that might still make sense of the situation. Around him, the room had shifted completely. Guests who had originally been passing through now lingered openly. Phones were raised without hesitation. A woman near the staircase whispered the name Sterling again, this time more carefully, as if she were trying to confirm a memory from a news article or a business magazine. Jada Sterling remained exactly where she had been standing since the confrontation began. Calm, balanced, patient. Her composure made the tension even sharper. Ethan cleared his throat and forced a small smile that looked more rehearsed than confident. Anyone can say they are a chief executive officer, he said carefully. That does not make it true. Jada gave a slight nod, almost appreciative of the statement. That is correct, she replied. Titles alone do not prove much. Ethan quickly seized on the agreement. Exactly, which means we still have a problem here. Daniel Ortiz glanced nervously at the reservation screen again, then back at Jada. The label had not changed. Owner priority access. The young concierge felt as if he were standing inside the middle of a test he had not studied for. Jada reached slowly into the pocket of her jacket and removed a phone. The movement was simple, unhurried, almost casual, but the effect it had on the room was immediate. Conversation stopped again. Ethan watched the phone appear in her hand with cautious curiosity. If you are calling someone to verify your claim, he said, attempting to recover control of the situation, I assure you the corporate office will confirm that the chief executive officer of Sterling Hospitality Group is not standing in my lobby dressed like a walk-in guest. Jada glanced at the screen of her phone and tapped once. That is exactly what we are about to find out, she said calmly. The call connected almost instantly. The speaker on the other end answered without hesitation. Good afternoon, Miss Sterling. The voice was clear and professional, carrying just enough through the quiet lobby for those closest to hear it. Ethan's expression shifted again. Jada did not raise the phone dramatically. She simply held it comfortably at her side as she spoke. Hello, Melissa, she said. Could you confirm something for the manager of the Sterling Grand in Chicago? There was a brief pause. Of course, Miss Sterling. Ethan's eyes moved from the phone to Jada's face and back again. The certainty he had relied on minutes earlier was beginning to drain away. Jada continued in the same calm voice. Could you please tell him who the chief executive officer of Sterling Hospitality Group is? Another short pause followed. The voice on the phone responded without the slightest hesitation. You are Miss Sterling. Jada Sterling, founder and chief executive officer. The words echoed lightly in the open lobby. Several guests exchanged startled looks. Daniel felt a rush of disbelief and relief at the same time. The bellhop beside the luggage cart muttered a quiet, "Oh wow," under his breath. Ethan Cole did not move. His eyes remained fixed on the phone as if it had suddenly become the most important object in the room. Jada lowered the phone slightly, but did not end the call yet. Thank you, Melissa, she said. One more thing. Yes, Miss Sterling. Jada glanced around the lobby slowly, taking in the guests, the front desk, the staff who now stood completely silent. Then she looked back at Ethan Cole, whose posture had finally lost the confidence it held only minutes earlier. Could you please confirm something else? She said gently. Who owns the Sterling Grand Hotel in Chicago? The voice on the phone answered immediately. That property is owned directly by Sterling Hospitality Group under your executive authority. This time the reaction in the lobby was unmistakable. A wave of whispers spread across the room as the truth settled into place. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Ethan Cole understood exactly who had been standing in front of him the entire time. The confirmation echoed through the Sterling Grand lobby like a quiet verdict that everyone had been waiting to hear, but no one had expected to arrive so clearly. That property is owned directly by Sterling Hospitality Group under your executive authority. The voice on the phone faded slightly as Jada Sterling lowered the device in her hand. For a moment, she did not speak. She simply allowed the words to settle into the room. Around her, the reaction unfolded slowly but unmistakably. A man near the staircase leaned toward his companion and whispered something urgently. The woman who had been filming lowered her phone just enough to stare openly now, her eyes wide with sudden recognition. Even the bellhop beside the luggage cart stood straighter, glancing between Jada and the hotel logo mounted high behind the desk. Sterling Grand. The name had always sounded impressive. Now it carried a very different weight. Daniel Ortiz felt a wave of realization wash through him. Training manuals had described owner visits as rare events that could happen without warning. They had emphasized one simple rule. When the owner of a property arrived, the role of every employee in the building shifted instantly. Daniel slowly stepped away from the computer terminal and stood respectfully beside the desk. Ethan Cole had not moved. His hands still rested on the marble counter, but the confidence that had filled his posture earlier had drained completely. He stared at Jada Sterling with an expression caught somewhere between disbelief and dawning awareness. The crowd around the lobby remained silent now, watching carefully. Jada slipped the phone back into her jacket pocket and met Ethan's gaze again. Her voice remained steady, calm, almost gentle, which somehow made the moment feel even more powerful. "You were correct about one thing earlier," she said. Ethan blinked slowly. "Earlier?" Jada nodded slightly. "You said that the owner of this hotel would not walk into the lobby dressed like an ordinary guest." Ethan swallowed, unsure how to respond. Jada continued, "That assumption is exactly why I visit my properties the way I do." A quiet murmur moved through the guests standing nearby. Jada rested one hand lightly on the marble desk again, the same place where the conversation had begun. "Because if I arrived with a motorcade, an assistant, and a formal announcement, every employee in this building would treat me perfectly." Her eyes moved briefly around the lobby, taking in the staff, the guests, the quiet phone still recording. "But that would not tell me how people are treated when no one believes they are important." Daniel lowered his gaze slightly, understanding the lesson unfolding in front of him. Ethan's shoulders shifted uneasily. For the first time since the confrontation began, he looked smaller behind the large desk he had controlled so confidently earlier. Jada's voice remained measured. "So I walk into my hotels the same way thousands of guests do every week. Alone, unannounced." She paused for a moment. "And today I learned something important." Ethan's eyes dropped briefly toward the reservation screen beside Daniel, still displaying her name clearly. Jada continued, not raising her voice, not changing her tone. "You were ready to remove me from a building that I built because you decided I did not belong here." The words carried through the quiet lobby with calm clarity. A guest near the elevators shook his head slowly. Another whispered again, this time louder, "That is the owner." Ethan Cole finally spoke, though the certainty that had defined his voice earlier was gone. "Ms. Sterling, I did not realize." Jada lifted her hand slightly, stopping the explanation before it could continue. "That is the point," she said quietly. The silence that followed felt different now. Not tense, not uncertain. It felt like the moment after a truth had been spoken so clearly that no one in the room could pretend they had not heard it. The silence after her words lingered for several seconds, heavy but no longer uncertain. The Sterling Grand lobby had changed completely. Only minutes earlier the room had been filled with quiet assumptions and casual authority. Now every person standing there understood exactly what had happened. Jada Sterling remained calm at the front desk, her posture relaxed, her expression steady. She did not look angry. She did not look triumphant. If anything, she looked thoughtful, as if she were reviewing the moment the way a leader studies a report that reveals something important about a system she built. Across the desk, Ethan Cole finally lowered his eyes. The marble counter that had felt like his command center earlier now looked more like a barrier he wished he could step away from. Around the lobby, the guests continued to whisper quietly, the name Sterling traveling from one small conversation to another. Daniel Ortiz stood beside the computer terminal, his shoulders straight, his attention fixed on Jada with the respectful awareness that the balance of authority in the room had shifted entirely. Jada slowly glanced around the lobby again, taking in the employees, the guests, the quiet cameras still capturing everything. Then she looked back at Ethan. "When I started Sterling Hospitality," she said calmly, "it was one hotel." The room listened. A small building in Phoenix with 32 rooms and a lobby half the size of this one. Her voice carried easily through the quiet space. "Back then, every guest mattered because we understood something simple. Respect is the foundation of hospitality." Ethan remained silent, his shoulders slightly lowered now. Jada continued, "That principle built every property we operate today. More than 100 hotels across the country." She paused briefly, letting the numbers settle in the minds of the people listening. But systems grow, companies grow, and sometimes the values that built them need to be tested. Daniel understood immediately what she meant. This visit had never been about checking into a suite. Jada's eyes returned to Ethan. Today was one of those tests. Ethan nodded faintly, unable to find words that would undo the moment. Jada did not raise her voice or change her tone. You were confident when you told me that I did not belong here. The sentence hung gently in the air. A guest near the elevators quietly said, "Wow," under his breath. Jada continued, "And confidence is not always wrong. Managers are responsible for protecting their properties." Ethan looked up briefly, uncertain if the statement was a defense or a warning. Jada's gaze remained steady. But protection should never replace judgment. She rested one hand lightly on the desk again. Hospitality is not about deciding who looks like they belong in a building. Several guests nodded quietly. Daniel felt a sense of relief and admiration at the same time. Jada reached into her jacket pocket once more and removed her phone. The movement immediately captured the room's attention again. She tapped the screen once and waited. The call connected quickly. "Melissa," she said calmly when the familiar voice answered. "Please notify the regional operations director that I am currently at the Sterling Grand in Chicago." Ethan's posture stiffened slightly. The lobby grew even quieter. Jada continued speaking in the same composed tone she had used from the beginning. "I would like a full review of this property's management practices beginning immediately." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Their meaning was clear to everyone standing there. Daniel felt his pulse rise again as the weight of the decision settled over the room. Jada listened briefly as Melissa responded through the phone, then nodded once. "Thank you," she said softly. She ended the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Then she looked at Ethan Cole one more time. The manager who had been so certain of his authority earlier now stood quietly behind the desk of a building he suddenly understood he did not truly control. The lobby of the Sterling Grand remained quiet long after the phone disappeared back into Jada Sterling's pocket. The moment had passed the point of tension and entered something else entirely, something heavier and more reflective. Guests who had gathered near the desk were no longer whispering with curiosity. Now they watched with the careful attention people give when they realize they have witnessed something rare. Jada stood calmly at the marble counter, the same place where the confrontation had begun. The hotel lights reflected softly off the polished floor beneath her feet. Ethan Cole remained behind the desk, his shoulders slightly lowered, his earlier certainty replaced by the unmistakable awareness that the entire situation had turned in a direction he had never imagined when he first spoke to her. Daniel Ortiz stood quietly beside the terminal, his hands resting respectfully at his sides, his expression steady but thoughtful. Jada looked once more across the lobby she had built years earlier through architectural plans, financial meetings, and long nights shaping the vision of Sterling Hospitality Group. The space was beautiful, exactly as she had imagined it when the project first existed only as sketches on a conference table in Los Angeles. Yet the most important part of any hotel had never been the marble, the lighting, or the chandeliers. It was the people who stood behind the desks and greeted the guests who walked through the doors every day. Jada turned her attention back to Ethan. Her voice remained calm and measured, the same tone she had used from the beginning of the encounter. "A hotel is not defined by its architecture," she said quietly. The guests listening nearby remained still. "It is defined by how people are treated the moment they walk through the door." Ethan nodded slowly, the weight of her words clearly settling over him. Jada continued, "Hospitality is not about deciding who deserves respect. It is about offering respect before you know anything about the person standing in front of you." A few of the guests exchanged thoughtful looks. The lesson in her voice carried further than the marble desk between them. Jada rested her hand briefly on the counter one last time before stepping back. The movement was small, but it signaled that the moment at the desk had reached its conclusion. "The review I requested will determine the next steps for this property's leadership," she said calmly. The words were direct, but not dramatic. They did not need to be. Everyone in the room understood what they meant. Ethan lowered his gaze again and nodded once, accepting the reality that had unfolded over the past several minutes. Daniel glanced toward the elevator bank as the quiet sound of the doors opening echoed across the lobby. Jada began walking toward them with the same composed pace she had carried when she first entered the building. As she passed the guests who had gathered nearby, several of them stepped slightly aside to clear her path. One man gave a respectful nod. A woman lowered her phone slowly, her expression now thoughtful rather than curious. Daniel watched her cross the polished floor and approach the elevators. Just before the doors closed, Jada turned slightly back toward the lobby. Her voice carried across the space one final time. "Respect is not something a person earns by appearance," she said gently. "It is something we choose to give." The elevator doors slid shut quietly. For several seconds the lobby remained completely still. Then conversations began again, softer this time, more reflective than before. Daniel looked around the room and realized that every person standing there had just witnessed the same lesson unfold in real time. In a building named after her, Jada Sterling had not raised her voice once. She had simply raised the standard.